My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the sister people overlook. At every family dinner, every holiday, Olivia was the one who drew the claps and the smiles while I sat quietly at the edge of the table. I learned to live with the silence, but silence has a way of keeping secrets no one expects. On New Year's Eve, with fireworks ready to burst over Lake Michigan, Olivia decided to humiliate me one more time, her words cutting through the noise and drawing laughter from the very people who should have defended me. I stayed quiet, I even smiled because deep down I knew something she didn't. What happens when the one you mock the loudest holds the truth you fear the most? Stay with me because this night was only the beginning, and the story that followed will leave you questioning what family really means. Let me take you back to where it began. The glass walls of the restaurant at Navy Pier glimmered against the cold night air as the countdown to midnight approached. Families filled the space with chatter and the clinking of glasses. Our tables stretched along the windows, giving a perfect view of Lake Michigan, where fireworks were about to burst. I sat near the end, my chair angled just slightly toward the water, trying to let the glow distract me from the way my sister's voice cut across the table. Olivia leaned forward in her sequined dress, a champagne flute already half gone in her hand. Her laugh was sharp and loud, the kind that made strangers turn their heads. She tapped her glass against the table and said loudly enough for our relatives to pause their conversations, "You'll never grow up, Emily. Stop living off other people and find a real job." Her words hung in the air like smoke spreading across the entire table. For a moment, silence followed, then a few nervous chuckles, and soon even my uncle let out a laugh, shaking his head. My mother Margaret tried to hush her. "Oh, Olivia, don't be like that." But Olivia only smirked and shrugged, pleased that she had drawn the attention she wanted. My father cleared his throat, pretending to study the wine list, but the smile tugging at the corner of his lips betrayed him. I stared down at my plate. The roasted chicken grew colder by the minute, the sauce thickening at the edges. I pressed my lips together and reached for my glass of water instead. That was my way of staying steady. Silence was the armor I had worn since childhood, the shield that had kept me from crumbling under the weight of comparison. It was easier to keep my head low and let them think I had nothing to say. Inside, though, I felt the heat crawl up my neck. My chest tightened as her words replayed. Living off others. No real job. I thought of the hundreds of nights spent with only the glow of a monitor and the hum of a fan writing lines of code that now powered banks, hospitals, and government offices. None of that mattered here. Not in this room, not at this table, not in front of these people who believed Olivia's voice was truth simply because it was the loudest. I caught Aunt Linda's eyes across the table. She gave me a small, knowing smile, the kind that said she understood, even if she would never say it out loud. Uncle Frank beside her slapped his knee and laughed at Olivia's jab. Some things never changed. The waiter arrived to refill champagne, and Olivia lifted her glass higher. She made sure to sit tall, the light from the chandelier catching the diamond ring she had been flaunting all evening. "Look at this." She stretched her hand so everyone could see. Not bad for someone who actually has a career. My cousins leaned in admiring it, murmuring about how beautiful the cut was. I stayed still, tracing the rim of my glass with my finger. I remembered the way my father once joked that Olivia was the firework of the family, dazzling and impossible to ignore, while I was the flashlight, steady but dull. Tonight was proof of that again. Everyone was waiting for her spark, her show, and I was invisible, just another piece of furniture in the room. My mother tried again. "Olivia, let's keep tonight light-hearted. It's New Year's Eve." Olivia only laughed louder, her earrings swinging as she shook her head. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. Some people refuse to grow up." The table broke into laughter again, though uneven this time, as if even they felt the sting. I lifted my fork and moved a piece of chicken around the plate, pretending to eat. My throat had closed up too tightly to swallow anything. Inside me, though, another voice whispered, "Just wait." The giant clock projected on the wall ticked closer to midnight. A buzz moved through the restaurant as people stood with their glasses ready. The city outside seemed to hold its breath lights glittering on the surface of the water. The DJ announced 10 minutes to midnight, and waiters hurried to pour the last round of champagne. Olivia leaned closer to my seat, her perfume strong, her smile sharp. "You know, one day you'll look back and regret not doing anything with your life." She sipped her drink, tilting her chin high. I nodded slightly, as if agreeing, and let my lips curve into a faint smile. I had learned long ago that nothing silenced a person like her more than refusing to rise to the bait. I thought of the document I had signed only 2 days earlier, approving her onboarding at the company she bragged about to friends without realizing the irony. My signature was there, quiet, steady, invisible. A flashlight in the dark. She would see it soon enough. The lights dimmed. The countdown began, voices rising across the room. 10. 9. 8. Olivia clinked her glass against our cousin's, throwing her head back, laughter ringing. 7. 6. 5. My mother leaned into my father's shoulder, whispering her hopes for a healthy year. 4. 3. 2. I glanced out the window at the black expanse of Lake Michigan, calm before the eruption. 1. The room thundered with shouts of Happy New Year. Fireworks exploded outside, painting the sky in red, gold, and blue. Glasses lifted high, kisses exchanged, cheers filling the air. Olivia twirled in her chair to capture the moment on her phone, squealing in delight. I simply stood, clapped softly, and looked at the colors reflecting in the water. And as the final burst faded and the smoke curled into the night, I felt the corners of my mouth lift again. Not the forced smile I wore at the table, but something quieter, steadier. Because I knew that once the noise died down, once the lights dimmed and reality returned, Olivia would discover something that no spotlight could hide. I sat back down, resting my hands in my lap, and let the last sparks fade from the sky. The ride home was quieter than usual, even with Olivia sitting across from me in the back seat of my father's SUV. The city streets were slick from melted snow, traffic lights casting long reflections on the pavement. My parents dozed in the front, my mother leaning against the window, my father humming along faintly to a Frank Sinatra song on the radio. Olivia scrolled her phone, her fingers moving quickly, her face lit by the blue glow of the screen. When we pulled into the driveway of my parents' house in Evanston, she climbed out without a word, clutching her purse and jacket. I followed her up the steps, the cold air stinging my cheeks. Inside the house still smelled faintly of pine from the Christmas tree they hadn't taken down yet. Olivia tossed her coat on the couch and muttered something about needing to check her messages before bed. I went to the guest room upstairs, slipping off my heels, my body grateful for the quiet. The hum of voices downstairs faded as I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the moonlight cutting across the quilt. I knew she would not be able to resist looking at her new paycheck. Pride had always been her fuel. Sometime past 1 a.m, I heard her door creak open across the hall. The faint sound of keys tapping reached my ears, then silence, then a low exhale, sharp and uneven. I pictured her at the desk, pulling up the email from Datavision HR, her eyes moving down the page until they reached the bottom. My name in black ink. My signature confirming her employment. Down the hall, a drawer slammed. Then, nothing. The next morning, sunlight streamed through thin curtains, and I found Olivia already in the kitchen, hair pulled back, coffee mug in hand. Her eyes were rimmed with red, though her smile was carefully painted on. She barely looked at me. "Morning," she said, her voice brittle. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a glass of orange juice. My parents bustled around, frying bacon and buttering toast, talking about resolutions and plans for spring. Olivia sat silent, sipping her coffee, tapping her nails against the ceramic. Every now and then her gaze flicked toward me, quick and sharp, before darting away. Later, when everyone went out for a walk to the lake, I stayed behind, claiming I had emails to check. Alone in the kitchen, I let myself breathe. I could almost see the image of her last night, frozen in front of the glowing screen, the realization sinking in. It was not revenge I felt. It was more like inevitability. That afternoon, back in my apartment in River North, I opened my laptop and logged into the internal system. Notifications filled the screen budgets, waiting for approval reports piling up after the holiday. Among them sat a new hire packet, her photo smiling stiffly in a beige blazer, her name typed neatly above. Olivia Carter. I clicked open the packet, scrolling through her employment details. Bachelor's degree in accounting, several years at a mid-sized firm, before layoffs a short stint at a boutique agency. Confident communicator, organized, eager to take on leadership roles. Notes from the initial interviewer read, "Strong potential, recommend for next round." My cursor hovered over the approval button. I had already clicked it once before Christmas, but seeing it again made my pulse thrum in my ears. I thought about her words at the restaurant, the way everyone laughed. Then I thought of the nights I had coded alone, the exhaustion, the determination. I tapped the button once more. Approved. That evening, Daniel called me on video. His face filled the screen, hair messy, a coffee mug in his hand. "She's in," he said. "Your sister. You sure you're fine with this?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the Chicago skyline, glowing behind him through his window. "She'll do her job like anyone else," I said. "And if she doesn't, the system will make that clear soon enough." He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "You're harder than you think, Em." I closed the laptop, letting the silence settle. On my counter sat a small calendar, the first page fresh and blank. January 2023. A new year, a new beginning, though not in the way Olivia expected. The following Monday, I received a ping from HR. Olivia Carter, start date confirmed, reporting to finance department. I pictured her walking into the River North office, heels clicking against marble floors, flashing that confident smile of hers. She would see Daniel in the hall, hear his voice carry through meetings, maybe even shake his hand. She would not know that the woman working quietly from a corner apartment a few miles away was the one who had signed every approval she would touch. That night, as I closed my laptop, the memory of her pale face under the glow of fireworks returned. She thought the night belonged to her, that the world applauded her brilliance. But the truth had already started to unravel, and I knew sooner or later she would no longer be able to deny it. When I was 12, the candles on my birthday cake burned low while everyone in the living room turned toward Olivia holding a gleaming dance trophy. My mother clapped so hard her rings clicked together. My father lifted Olivia in the air, and the chorus of "Happy Birthday" died somewhere between their cheers. I stood frozen, the wax dripping, the wish unspoken. No one noticed when the candles burned out on their own. That memory had lived in me like a shadow, reminding me that even at my own celebration, the spotlight belonged elsewhere. Olivia loved being the center of attention, and the world obliged her. I was the quiet one, the girl who could sit with a book for hours or take apart a broken radio just to see how it worked. My father once joked that we had a firework and a flashlight under the same roof. Olivia exploded in color, dazzling and loud, while I glowed steady and unremarkable. The older we grew, the sharper the contrast became. Olivia enrolled in art classes, posed for local magazines, and strutted across small stages in sequined dresses. She brought home stories, applause, the sparkle that my parents adored. I buried myself in the glow of a computer screen, teaching myself to code from borrowed manuals and clunky second-hand machines. At high school graduation, my parents posed for photo after photo with Olivia and her bouquet of roses, while I stood at the edge with my honors cord unnoticed. It was not that they hated me. It was that they simply never saw me. I was quiet, steady, easy to overlook. They mistook silence for emptiness, when in truth, silence was where my mind lit up brightest. Years later, at the University of Illinois, I met Daniel Brooks. He was the opposite of me in every way, charming, comfortable with strangers, able to speak to a room without breaking a sweat. I remember one rainy night in our senior year when we sat in the corner of the library, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups. We were sketching out an idea on the back of a napkin, an intelligent system that could analyze data in real time. Daniel's eyes lit with possibility while I filled notebook pages with algorithms. That night was the beginning of data vision. After graduation, we rented a drafty garage in Evanston, our desks made from plywood balanced on crates. 2 laptops buzzed against the cold while we worked until dawn. Daniel handled investors and pitches while I handled the endless code debugging line after line until my eyes blurred. In 2016, our first small contract arrived. A regional bank agreed to test our system. I stayed awake for 48 hours straight, monitoring performance heart racing every time the system lagged. When the report came back with glowing reviews, Daniel burst into our garage with 2 paper cups of champagne. He called it our first miracle. By 2018, Data Vision was valued at $25 million. Daniel appeared on local business panels shaking hands with men in tailored suits. I declined every invitation, choosing to remain the quiet, half the hidden engine. My name lived only in contracts, legal filings, and the code repository that grew heavier each week. I owned half of the company, but the world believed Daniel had built it alone. That was how I wanted it. Fame had never interested me. The work did. I thought of those early years often, especially when Olivia's words cut deep. Living off others. No real job. If only she had seen me, then hunched over a flickering screen at 3 a.m, hands cramped from typing, eyes burning. If only she had seen the way Daniel and I fought through near bankruptcy, the way we kept coding even when the heat went out and our breath fogged in front of us. Instead, she saw the quiet sister at family dinners, the one who bought pies, and sat at the corner of the table. She never asked what filled my days or nights. To her, I was simply drifting, waiting for someone else to carry me. Even when our company broke into national contracts, hospitals adopting our system, and government agencies signing on, I kept my name hidden. Daniel understood. He respected my need for privacy. He smiled for cameras while I built in the dark. That silence became my shield. It kept me safe, but it also fed the illusion that Olivia clung to. To her, I was still the girl with the unlit candles, the flashlight too dim to matter. I leaned back in my chair that evening, staring at the Chicago skyline outside my apartment window. Lights twinkled across the river, steady and sure. I thought of my father's old words, firework and flashlight. Maybe he had been right. Olivia would always be the firework, blazing for a few brief seconds, and then gone. I was the flashlight, not dazzling but steady enough to guide through the dark. And soon she would realize how much light a flashlight could hold. In the spring of 2015, Daniel and I stood outside the garage we had rented in Evanston, staring at the rusted door that barely locked. The space smelled of oil and damp concrete, but to us it felt like possibility. We dragged in 2 folding tables from a yard sale, balanced laptops on top, and told ourselves we were building something that would matter. He cracked a joke about starting in a palace someday, and I laughed, knowing full well that palaces were not what I was after. I only wanted the code to work. That first year was nothing but long nights and cheap coffee. Daniel pitched our idea to anyone who would listen, driving to every networking event he could find, while I sat hunched over my keyboard fixing bugs. My fingers ached, my eyes burned, but when a new line of code finally ran clean, I felt a surge that made it all worth it. The hum of the laptop was my music, the blinking cursor my applause. By the fall of 2016, a small regional bank gave us a chance. They wanted to test our system for fraud detection. Daniel celebrated with takeout pizza and a bottle of grocery store champagne. I stayed awake for 2 days straight, watching every input and output, terrified the system would crash. When the trial ended with glowing reviews, we hugged each other in that freezing garage, as if we had conquered the world. The years blurred together. Contracts grew, first with hospitals, then with retail companies, and slowly our name spread. Daniel thrived in the spotlight, his face appearing in local business magazines, his voice carrying across investor meetings. I declined every request for interviews. I told him I preferred the work to the attention, and he never pushed me otherwise. He knew that visibility felt like exposure, like stripping away the safety I had built for myself. By 2018, Data Vision was valued at $25 million. Investors wanted to expand quickly, asking about our growth strategy, pressuring us to hire aggressively. Daniel handled the negotiations, shaking hands, making promises. I sat quietly in the back of those meetings, taking notes and answering technical questions when pressed. At the signing of one particularly large deal, an investor leaned across the table and said with a smirk, "I assume you're his assistant." I swallowed the sting and forced a polite smile. Daniel corrected him firmly, but the man only laughed. That moment might have broken me years earlier, but by then, I had already accepted my place. I did not crave the recognition. I wanted control of the product to see it built right. The headlines could belong to Daniel. The code belonged to me. Late that year, we moved from the garage into a real office space in River North. The walls were bare, the desks mismatched, but the view of the Chicago River made me pause the first night I stayed late. I pressed my forehead against the glass, watching the city lights ripple across the water, and thought of the girl at 12 who never got to blow out her candles. She would have been proud of this. Daniel dropped by my desk with 2 cups of coffee. "You realize we just hired our 50th employee, right?" he said. I smiled. It did not feel real, and in some ways it still does not. Growth was never my dream. Building was. By 2020, our technology had been integrated into national banking systems and adopted by government agencies for risk assessment. The valuation climbed past 100 million. Reporters asked Daniel about our origin story. He always mentioned me, but because I refused interviews, they printed his name alone. Friends from college would send me clippings of him on stage at conferences, his smile broad and confident. I kept those photos in a folder, not out of resentment, but as a reminder of the bargain I had made with myself. Privacy for peace. Sometimes I wondered if staying in the shadows had been the right choice. There were moments I wanted to stand up and say I was there from the beginning, that every line of code they praised had passed under my fingertips. But then I would think of Olivia's smug smile at family dinners, the way she thrived on attention, and I would retreat again. Better to let her believe I was nobody. Better to let the truth remain tucked inside documents she would never see. Still, the silence carried a weight. At night, when I turned off the monitor and the apartment fell dark, I felt the ache of invisibility pressing on my chest. My parents never asked about data vision, never cared to understand. To them, Olivia's art shows and magazine spreads were more impressive than anything I could do with algorithms. I stopped correcting them. I stopped expecting their pride. And yet, despite all of that, I knew the work mattered. Every contract meant more jobs, created more security for clients, more innovation built from nothing but persistence. In that knowledge, I found peace. I leaned back in my chair one evening in early 2023, the city lights spilling across the room. We were planning our 5-year gala by then, a celebration of survival and success. Daniel wanted me on stage with him. I told him I would think about it. He grinned knowingly, as if he could already see me standing beside him. The thought made my stomach twist. To step into the light even for one night would mean facing every assumption my family ever made about me. It would mean Olivia's laughter falling flat at last. I closed my laptop and let the screen fade to black. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the time for hiding was slipping away. Olivia's voice carried across the table at our parents' house the week after New Year's. The smell of pot roast filled the dining room, steam rising from mashed potatoes, but her words left little space for warmth. She swirled her wine glass and announced that she had officially applied to a new company, Data Vision. She leaned back in her chair with the kind of smile that dared anyone to challenge her. "They would be lucky to have me," she said. "If they pass, it is their loss." My father chuckled and nodded. My mother beamed with pride. Uncle Frank clapped his hands together like she had just won another trophy. Aunt Linda offered a polite smile, though her eyes flickered to me with a trace of something softer. I felt the corners of my lips press into a thin line. I cut into my meat, slowly chewing carefully, letting her words echo without response. Inside, a quiet laugh rose in me, sharp and almost bitter. Of all the places she could have chosen, she had landed on the very company that had lived in my hands for nearly a decade. She went on about how the accounting firm she had worked for had been mismanaged, how she deserved better, how she was ready to show the world what she could do. Every sentence was a performance punctuated with hand gestures and dramatic pauses. My parents nodded along, not noticing the way my knife trembled just slightly as I held it. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to lean across the table and say, Olivia, I approve your file before the holidays. Your employment letter already carries my signature. But the words stayed locked in my throat. I had learned to keep my victories private, to let silence do the work. After dessert, I excused myself early. I walked out into the cold January air, my breath rising in thin clouds, and drove back to my apartment in River North. The city lights blinked around me as if they alone understood my secret. Once inside, I slipped off my coat, hung it neatly by the door, and went straight to my desk. The glow of my laptop bathed the room as I logged into the system. There it was again, her smiling photo on the HR dashboard, her resume attached, her references listed. I scrolled past it all to the line at the bottom. New hire approved. My name printed there, steady and undeniable. For a long moment, I stared at it, my fingers hovering above the trackpad. Then I clicked the 3 dots in the corner, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see the options again. Forward, copy, remove, approve. My chest tightened as I tapped the final button, once more sealing what I had already done weeks earlier. The approval email sent instantly. Somewhere across the city, maybe even in her inbox already, Olivia's confirmation would arrive. She would open it with pride, never noticing the quiet name attached to the digital signature at the bottom. Later that night, Daniel called. His hair was messy, his voice easy as always, but his eyes searched mine through the screen. She is in, he said. Are you sure you are all right with this? I leaned back, letting the chair creak, and folded my arms. She will do her job like anyone else. If she cannot, the system will show it soon enough. He studied me for a beat, then gave a small nod. You are tougher than you think, Em. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a while. The hum of the refrigerator in the next room was the only sound. I thought of her laughter at Navy Pier, the sting of her words in front of our family. Then I thought of the look she would have when she finally understood that the paycheck she clutched so tightly came from me. I did not want revenge in the traditional sense. I did not want to see her fail or collapse under humiliation. What I wanted was something quieter but sharper. I wanted her to see me, to understand that the sister she dismissed as useless had been carrying a world larger than her imagination. Outside, snow began to fall again, dusting the sidewalks and muffling the noise of the city. I closed my laptop and stood by the window, watching the flakes drift past the glass. Olivia was preparing to step into a company she thought was her next opportunity. She had no idea she was walking into a space built line by line, file by file, by the sister she had spent her whole life mocking. I pulled the curtains shut, turned off the light, and let the room fall into darkness. The morning Olivia started at Datavision, the January air was brittle. The streets of River North lined with dirty snow pushed against the curbs. I stayed home that day, sipping coffee at my small kitchen table, knowing exactly how she would carry herself through the glass doors of our office. She had always been good at first impressions. I pictured her walking across the lobby, heels clicking against the polished floor, her blazer-fitted just right hair shining under the recessed lights. She would flash that confident smile at the receptionist and introduce herself as if she were arriving to rescue the company, rather than joining it. That was Olivia's way. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me from his office. He turned the camera to show the common area where new hires were mingling. There, she was standing near the espresso machine, already holding court with 2 junior analysts. Her laughter rang clear through his phone speakers. She looks right at home, Daniel said. I watched silently as she gestured with her hands, describing her past work, downplaying the closure of her last firm, as if it had been her choice. The 2 young employees nodded wide-eyed, buying every word. She always did know how to sell herself, I muttered. Daniel glanced back at me. You sure you want to keep this quiet? At some point, people will put it together. Let them wonder, I said, shutting my laptop. That first week, I stayed out of sight. I logged in at night, reviewing budgets, checking approvals, making sure the systems ran smoothly. I wanted to see how she would settle in when she thought no one was watching. By Friday, whispers had already begun. During a late-night system check, I overheard a snippet on the internal chat. "Who is this Eleanor Green listed as approving every major budget? Some kind of legal placeholder." Another wrote, "Maybe just a ghost signature and name to make investors feel better." I leaned back in my chair, a small smile tugging at me. Ghost in the system. That was fine. Ghosts could still hold power. The following Monday, Daniel stopped by my apartment before heading into the office. He carried a bag of bagels and a coffee for me. "She is doing fine," he said between bites. "Confident, a little showy, but she is getting attention in the finance department." I stirred cream into my coffee and stayed quiet. Part of me wanted her to succeed. If she failed, my parents would see me as cruel for allowing it. If she succeeded, she would still be working under my unseen hand. Either way, the truth lingered behind the curtain. A week later, I logged into the camera system I had designed years earlier for office security. It was not something I used often, but curiosity pulled me in. From the feed in the ninth-floor kitchen, I saw her again pouring coffee, chatting with Karen Mitchell from finance. Karen was sharp, diligent, not easily impressed. She listened politely while Olivia explained how her experience would elevate Datavision's budget planning. Olivia waved her hand toward the digital bulletin board on the wall, where ongoing projects scrolled across the screen. "This company is lucky to have me," Olivia said. "And I heard no one even knows who the second founder Island might just be a name on paper." Karen tilted her head but said nothing. Olivia laughed and turned back to her coffee, clearly amused by her own words. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the screen soft against my face. The irony was almost too much. There she stood, mocking the very person who had approved her hiring, who signed every paycheck, who kept the lights on in that office. That night Daniel called again. He leaned close to the camera. "She is off to a good start. Are you sure you want to let this play out?" I nodded. "For now. If she is good, the opportunity will shape her. If she is not, the truth will surface sooner." He studied me for a moment. "You sound like you almost want to see what she does when no one is clapping." "Exactly," I said. When the call ended, I walked to the window. The Chicago skyline glittered under a thin veil of fog, each building outlined against the dark. My reflection stared back at me, calm and steady. I pressed my hand against the glass, thinking of the firework and the flashlight. For once, the flashlight was shining into her world, even if she could not yet see it. Days passed, then weeks. Each night I checked the systems, saw her proposals, her notes. She was quick with words, persuasive in meetings, but numbers told another story. Some of her calculations skimmed too close to error. I let it be for now, curious how she would handle the cracks when they widened. One evening, long after the office had emptied, I was in the basement server room checking a new deployment. The hum of machines filled the air, steady and low. I closed the cabinet and turned, and that was when I heard the click of heels in the hallway. She appeared in the doorway, startled to see me there. "Eleanor," she said slowly, suspicion tightening her voice. "What are you doing down here? Only senior management has access." I smiled, softly keeping my voice calm. "I guess I have special access." She frowned, her eyes narrowing, about to press further, when Daniel stepped out from the adjacent room holding a folder. "Hey Eleanor, could you look over the AI deployment plan? Needs your signature by Friday." I took the file from him and glanced back at Olivia. Her face froze, her lips parted, but no words came. Daniel walked on, already talking about system performance, leaving her in the doorway. She stared at me, questions burning behind her eyes. There was no need for words. The seed of doubt had been planted, and now I would see how long it took before it bloomed. The Sunday after that hallway encounter, my parents called us all together for dinner at their house in Evanston. The cold air outside cut sharp against my face as I walked up the front steps, the driveway still edged with dirty piles of snow. Inside, the familiar smell of roast chicken and buttered rolls wrapped around me, warm and heavy. My mother fussed in the kitchen, my father adjusted his tie, as if the occasion required more formality than usual, and Olivia sat already at the dining table scrolling on her phone, with a smug little smile tugging at her lips. We gathered around the long oak table, the one that had seen every holiday and birthday since we were children. The silverware clinked softly, glasses filled, napkins folded. I kept my eyes on my plate, trying to brace myself for whatever announcement had clearly been planned. My father always cleared his throat when he was about to say something important, and he did exactly that once everyone had taken their seats. "Your mother and I have been giving thought to the future," he began, voice carrying with practiced authority. "We want to make sure the family home stays in good hands." I felt the muscles in my shoulders tighten. Olivia immediately looked up from her phone, eyes bright as if she already knew the prize was hers. "We have decided," my father continued, "that the house will go to Olivia. She is the eldest, she has proven herself responsible, and it feels only right." A hush settled across the table. My mother smiled quickly, almost nervously, and added, "Emily will of course be cared for in other ways, but Olivia will inherit the house. It is important to keep it with the one most settled." I gripped my fork a little too tightly, the metal pressing into my palm. The roasted carrots on my plate blurred for a moment as heat rose in my chest. It was not shock. I had learned long ago not to expect recognition. It was the familiar ache of being dismissed once again as the child who had never measured up. Olivia sat straighter, her cheeks flushed with pride. She tucked her phone into her purse and folded her hands neatly as if preparing to receive applause. My father nodded toward her approvingly, and my mother touched her arm in affirmation. Uncle Frank, seated at the end of the table, let out a booming laugh. "Well, that settles it. Olivia has always been the one for responsibility. And Emily, you are good with those computers, right? You will be just fine without a house." His laugh grated against my ears. I forced a polite smile and reached for my water glass. Aunt Linda, ever the quiet observer, finally spoke. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Emily has always been steady. Sometimes the quiet ones are the strongest." The table went still for a moment, the weight of her words landing between us. My mother cleared her throat, uncomfortable, and passed the bowl of potatoes to Olivia, shifting the conversation away. I kept chewing, mechanically tasting little. My mind was already slipping back to the office, to the flicker of recognition I had seen in Olivia's eyes when Daniel had handed me that folder. She was starting to sense something. Tonight, as she reveled in her new status, I wondered how long it would take before doubt consumed her. Dinner stretched on with the usual chatter about neighbors, the weather, spring plans. Olivia soaked up every question about her job hunt, speaking confidently about the firms she had considered before settling on Datavision. She glossed over the layoffs at her old company, spinning the story to her advantage, as she always did. My parents listened rapt, nodding at every word. When dessert came out, a pie still warm from the oven, I excused myself to help in the kitchen. The clatter of dishes was oddly comforting. Aunt Linda joined me, setting down a stack of plates with a soft sigh. She leaned close, her voice lowered so only I could hear. "You are stronger than they know, Emily. Do not let their choices weigh on you too heavily." I looked at her, surprised by the clarity in her eyes. She had always been kind, but this was more than kindness. It was recognition. I nodded once, unable to speak, grateful for her quiet solidarity. Back at the table, Olivia was laughing at something Frank had said. She held her wine glass loosely, her cheeks flushed with triumph. My father was leaning back in his chair, satisfied, my mother glowing beside him. It was a picture of a family, aligned with me as the faint outline in the background. The drive back to the city that night was long and quiet. My headlights cut through the icy dark, the radio playing low. My chest still carried the weight of my father's words, the sting of being brushed aside yet again. But beneath the ache, a strange calm settled. They could hand her the house, they could hand her the spotlight, but she was already working inside walls that I had built, systems that I had designed, paychecks that bore my name. She was living inside my creation without even realizing it. When I reached my apartment, I slipped off my boots, hung my coat, and went straight to the window. The Chicago skyline shimmered across the river, each light reflecting against the black water. I stood there for a long time, palms resting against the glass. My parents might never see me clearly, might never hand me the home I had grown up in. But Olivia could not escape the truth forever. I thought of her eyes in that basement hallway, narrowed with suspicion, lips parted with a question she had not asked. The seed was there, and with every budget she touched, with every paycheck she opened, the truth would press harder against her denial. Outside, snow began to fall again, drifting softly onto the streets below. The city grew quiet, wrapped in white. I closed the curtains and sat on the edge of my bed, the silence of the apartment pressing around me. For years I had lived in the shadows, content to let them believe whatever story they wanted about me. But now, as Olivia settled into her new role, as my parents tightened their blindfolds, I could feel the edges of that story fraying. It would not be long before the fabric tore wide open. And when it did, no inheritance or family dinner pronouncement could protect her from the light waiting on the other side. A month into Olivia's new role, the cracks began to show. At first, it was small things, a formula typed wrong in a spreadsheet, or a number misaligned in a budget table. Karen Mitchell, sharp-eyed and steady, quietly corrected her a few times. But then came the day the mistake could not be patched so easily. It was late on a Thursday afternoon when the finance department finalized the quarterly budget report for one of our largest AI projects. Olivia had been responsible for preparing the numbers before the documents went out to a major banking client. She had rushed through revisions, confident as always, speaking loudly about how efficient she was. But confidence does not correct math. By Friday morning, my phone buzzed with an urgent notification from the internal system. Discrepancy flagged in financial report. I opened the file and felt my stomach sink. Entire sections had been calculated wrong, expense lines duplicated, projections off by nearly $2 million. If the bank had acted on those numbers, the fallout could have been disastrous. Daniel called me minutes later, his tone tight. "We have a problem. The bank caught the errors before finalizing, but their legal team is demanding answers. James Miller is already looped in." I rubbed my forehead, exhaustion pressing behind my eyes. "Who signed off on the draft?" I asked. "Olivia," he said flatly. "She was the lead on this submission." That afternoon, I logged into the office security feed. The finance floor was buzzing, employees, whispering, heads bent together. Olivia sat at her desk, shoulders stiff, her smile gone. Karen stood nearby, arms crossed, expression grim. She had clearly warned Olivia before. Now the mistake was public. A little later, Daniel called again, this time from the conference room. His camera showed James Miller's sleeves rolled up, stacks of papers spread across the table. James's voice carried through the speaker. "If this bank decides negligence was involved, Datavision could face penalties. We need to respond carefully." Daniel turned the camera toward me. "You are the technical sign-off, Emily. What do you want to do?" I stared at the screen for a long moment, my mind racing. Olivia was my sister, yes, but she was also an employee whose error had nearly put the company at risk. My company. I swallowed hard. Fix the numbers tonight. Reissue corrected reports by morning. And James draft an official apology that frames this as human error caught before any damage occurred. James nodded, already scribbling notes. Daniel gave me a quick look, part concern, part relief. He knew I was walking a line between family and business. That evening, long after most employees had gone home, I drove to the office. The River North streets were quiet, snow falling in lazy flakes. Inside, the building hummed with the low buzz of fluorescent lights. On the 9th floor, I found Karen still at her desk, glasses perched on her nose, typing furiously. She looked up as I approached, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You are here late," she said carefully. "So are you," I answered. She hesitated, then added, "Olivia is still in the conference room. She has been pacing for hours." I nodded and continued down the hall. Through the glass wall, I saw Olivia, hair pulled back, messily, jacket draped over a chair. She was flipping through pages, muttering under her breath, frustration sharp in every movement. When I stepped inside, she froze. Her eyes darted to the folder in my hands, then back to my face. You. I set the folder on the table and spoke evenly. The numbers need to be corrected by morning. I am here to make sure that happens. Her mouth opened, then shut. For the first time in a long time, she had no quick retort. She sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. I did not know it was you, she whispered, not looking at me. I remained standing calm, steady. That is not what matters right now. What matters is fixing this. For the next 3 hours, we worked side by side. I guided her through the corrections, pointing out where formulas had broken, showing her how to run checks against the system. She followed instructions slower than I preferred, but careful this time. Every so often, she glanced at me with a mixture of disbelief and something like shame. Near midnight, Daniel appeared in the doorway carrying coffee. He raised an eyebrow at the sight of us together. How are we doing? Almost there, I said, scanning the last sheet. Olivia kept her head down, typing corrections. When she finished, she leaned back with a long exhale. Done. I collected the papers and logged into the system to upload the revised report. The confirmation pinged on the screen. Corrected. Clean. Safe. Daniel clapped his hands lightly. Good. James can send the apology letter first thing. We dodged this one. He left us then, leaving Olivia and me in the silence of the room. She stared at her hands, twisting them together. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. I thought you were nothing. All these years I told myself you were wasting your life. I did not answer right away. I closed the file folder, placed it neatly in my bag, and looked at her. People see what they want to see, Olivia. That does not make it true. Her eyes met mine, wide and unsettled. She wanted to argue I could see it, but the words would not come. I left her there, the snow still falling outside the office, humming with quiet. For the first time, she had been forced to sit in the glow of the flashlight she had mocked. And I could tell the light was only beginning to burn. The following week, I stayed late at the office more often, partly because the servers needed updates, but mostly because I knew the hours after 6 were when Olivia had already gone home. The empty hallways gave me room to think, to breathe, without the constant undercurrent of suspicion. But one evening, just after 9, the rhythm shifted. I was in the basement server room, the hum of machines vibrating softly under my feet, when I heard footsteps above the mechanical drone. Sharp, deliberate, the sound of heels against concrete. I looked up just as the door opened, and there she was. Olivia froze in the doorway, her face pale against the fluorescent light. Her eyes darted from the server racks to the console I was typing on, then landed squarely on me. For a moment she seemed unable to move, her chest rising and falling quickly. "What are you doing down here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "Only senior management has access to this floor." I met her gaze calmly. "I guess I have special access." Her brow furrowed, suspicion burning hotter now. "You do not belong here, Emily." Before I could respond, Daniel stepped out from the adjoining room, a folder in his hands. His tone was casual, but his presence shattered the tension. "Hey, Eleanor, can you take a look at the new AI deployment plan? It needs your sign-off before Friday." He handed me the folder without hesitation, then glanced at Olivia with a nod before turning back down the hall. I opened the folder, signed quickly, and returned it. Daniel thanked me and walked away, leaving silence in his wake. Olivia's eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted. Her gaze flicked from the closed door back to me. "You signed that," she whispered almost to herself. I tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, watching her closely. "Yes." Her breath hitched. "So it is true, you are the one." I closed the console and stepped closer, my voice steady. "Since the beginning, Daniel and I built this place from scratch." She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "All this time, I thought you were nothing. I thought you were wasting your life hiding in your little apartment, playing with numbers no one cared about." I tilted my head, letting her words hang in the cold air. "People see what they want to see, Olivia. That does not make it true." Her posture sagged for the first time. She lowered herself into a chair, staring at the glowing lights of the servers as if they might give her an answer. "Every paycheck," she murmured, "every budget file, every approval. It was you. I leaned against the desk, crossing my arms. Yes. Silence stretched between us, heavy, with years of mockery, misunderstandings, and unspoken truths. She finally looked up, eyes glistening, though she tried to mask it with defiance. Why didn't you say anything? Why let me humiliate you? Because I never needed your approval, I said. And because I wanted to see who you were when no one was clapping. She pressed her lips together, her jaw tight, but the fight in her eyes wavered. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words would not come. The hum of the servers filled the space. I could almost hear her memories clicking into place, every cruel laugh, every cutting remark at family dinners colliding with the truth she had just witnessed. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse. I do not know how to live with this. I softened slightly, though I did not move closer. You live with it by working, by proving yourself through action, not noise. That is how I did it, her hands clenched in her lap. You should hate me. I looked at her evenly. Hate wastes energy. I have better things to build. She flinched, the words hitting harder than any raised voice could. For a long while she sat in silence, staring at the servers as if they were mirrors reflecting back the truth she did not want to see. Eventually I walked toward the door. At the threshold I paused, my voice quieter this time. You have talent, Olivia. But talent means nothing without humility. I left her sitting alone in the pale light, the machines humming like a judgment that could not be silenced. Later that night in my apartment overlooking the river, I brewed tea and set it on the table beside my laptop. The steam curled upward, soft and fragile, and I thought of childhood birthdays, of trophies that had shone under the living room light, while my own candles burned unnoticed. I thought of my father's old words about fireworks and flashlights, the sharp divide that had been drawn between us before we even understood what it meant. Now the lines were blurred. Olivia had walked straight into the world I built, and the foundation beneath her feet was mine. She could deny it, resist it, even resent it, but she could not undo it. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Daniel. She knows. I typed back slowly one word. Good. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the glittering skyline. The city was quiet, the streets covered with a thin dusting of snow. For the first time in years, I felt no need to hide. The truth was no longer a secret I carried alone, and yet I knew this was only the beginning. Recognition was not the same as acceptance. Olivia had seen the light, but whether she could bear to stand in it was another matter entirely. I sipped my tea, the warmth filling me from within. Somewhere in that silence, I sensed the story shifting. The seed had broken through the soil. What grew next would depend on her. The 5-year anniversary gala for Datavision arrived on a cold Saturday night in March. The glass building by the river glowed with chandeliers that spilled light across the lobby floor, catching on sequined gowns and polished shoes. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood in the dressing room, staring at my reflection in the mirror. A black dress hugged me simply but firmly, my hair pinned in a neat twist. I had spent so many years in shadows, but tonight there would be nowhere to hide. Daniel knocked on the door, his smile easy as always. Ready, Eleanor? Not really, I admitted, smoothing the fabric over my hips. He chuckled. You are not stepping out. You are stepping up. The hum of voices swelled as we moved to the wings of the stage. The MC finished her introduction with practiced energy. And now please welcome the 2 co-founders of Datavision, Daniel Hart and Eleanor Carter. Applause thundered. The lights were blinding at first, a flood of warmth across my skin. My steps felt heavier than they should have, but when I glanced to my left and saw Daniel's calm stride, I forced myself to keep moving. Faces blurred into a sea until I caught sight of one at the back of the room. Olivia. She stood still, a glass of champagne in her hand, her posture rigid. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes wide as if she were seeing a stranger wearing my face. Daniel took the microphone first, his voice confident and familiar to the crowd. He spoke about our early days, the garage near Evanston, the nights we worked until dawn with empty coffee cups piled high, the investors who took chances on us. The audience laughed and clapped in rhythm with his anecdotes. Then he turned to me, extending the microphone. For a moment, I wanted to retreat, but the silence stretched waiting. I lifted it, my voice trembling at first, but steadying with each word. Hi everyone, I am Eleanor Carter. For many of you, this is the first time you have actually seen me. A ripple of soft laughter filled the room, warm and gentle. I am not great at public speaking, I continued, but I wanted to be here tonight because 5 years ago Daniel and I had nothing but an idea. We believed technology could be built on trust. That belief carried us here not into headlines or cameras, but into partnerships that matter. The crowd clapped again and I nodded grateful before stepping back. Relief washed over me, the weight of years of silence loosening from my chest. Dinner began soon after, and I slipped into the crowd, shaking hands and answering questions. Engineers laughed, admitting they had thought I was a myth. A banker clapped me on the shoulder, saying my work had saved his team months of mistakes. Their words warmed me, but my eyes kept searching. Olivia was no longer by the back wall. I spotted her near a pillar, her glass set aside, her hands folded tightly. I hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Before I could decide, Daniel leaned close. She saw everything. I nodded, swallowing hard. Later, as dessert was served and the chatter rose, I found myself outside on the terrace, the city skyline glittering across the water. The cold air steadied me, cutting through the heat of the evening. I wrapped my arms around myself and breathed. The door opened behind me. Olivia stepped out, her shoulders stiff against the chill. For a long moment she said nothing, standing a few feet away. "So it is true," she said finally, her voice low. "You were the one all along." I turned slightly, watching her expression. "Yes." She let out a short laugh, but there was no triumph in it, just disbelief. "While I was parading around, you were building this." I did not move closer. I wanted her to come to the truth on her own. "All those times I mocked you," she continued, shaking her head. "I told myself you would never grow up, that you would always be the quiet one with nothing to show." I sipped the cold air like water. "And now?" She looked at me, her eyes wet but unblinking. "And now I see I was blind." We stood in silence, the sounds of music and laughter drifting faintly from inside. She took a step closer, her voice breaking. "I do not know how to face you after everything I said." I set my hand on the railing, fingers brushing the cold metal. "You face me by doing the work, by proving yourself with action. That is all I ever did." Her lips trembled. "I thought I was the star, the firework. And you were just a flashlight." My father's words came back to me like a faint echo. "Steady," I said quietly. "A flashlight holds more light than people think." She let out a shaky breath, then turned her gaze toward the skyline. The city lights reflected in her eyes, softer now, no longer sharp with pride. Inside, the music swelled as a new song began. I knew I should return that conversations, and congratulations waited. But for that moment, I stayed beside her, the cold air wrapping us both in stillness. She did not apologize, and I did not ask for one. The silence between us spoke enough. I slipped back inside soon after, the warmth and chatter enveloping me again. Olivia remained outside, her figure framed by the glass doors. For the first time, I felt the weight of the shadows lifting completely. The world knew my name now, and Olivia did too. What came next was no longer in my hands. 2 mornings after the gala, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The city was still shaking off its sleep, the streets wet from overnight rain. I carried a small walnut box in my bag, something I had kept tucked away since college. Inside was a linen-covered notebook, a black ink pen, and a card I had written late the night before. The words were plain, not dramatic, but honest. I slipped into the 10th floor conference room and placed the box inside a drawer. When the delivery assistant came by with files for distribution, I handed him the notebook with a simple instruction: "Give this to Olivia Carter, no sender." He nodded and left, never questioning. The rest of that week passed in its usual blur of meetings and approvals. Olivia did not say a word about the notebook. No email, no message, no knock at my door. I convinced myself I had not expected a reply anyway. Still, I found myself wondering. On Thursday, I walked past the main conference room during a budget presentation. Through the glass wall, I saw Olivia standing before the team, a stack of papers in her hand. Her voice was calm, steady, as she explained the adjustments she had made to control overspending on one of our AI projects. Karen sat to the side watching her with an approving nod. The Olivia I knew would have filled the air with confidence and charm, but this Olivia spoke, simply letting the numbers carry her point. I lingered in the hallway until the presentation ended, then slipped away before anyone noticed. The following week, an email crossed my desk from HR. Attached was a proposal for an internal sponsorship initiative designed for junior employees, especially female interns in technical roles. The title was Touch the Screen, Touch the Future. At the bottom was a note in italics, inspired by the quiet mission of Eleanor Carter. I read it twice, then a third time. It was Olivia's proposal. That afternoon, I found her in the pantry, pouring hot water into a carafe of tea. She turned and saw me, and for a second, we both froze. Then she cleared her throat, her gaze softer than I had ever seen it. "The pen," she said quietly. "And the notebook. I have been writing." I nodded. "I am glad you liked it." She hesitated, then looked down at her cup. "I do not think I ever really understood you. Maybe I never even tried." Her words hung in the air, fragile but real. She glanced back up, her voice lower. "You gave me a chance when you could have thrown me out. You never used your power to put me down, even after everything I said. That says more about you than I ever wanted to admit." For once, I did not feel the need to answer. I just gave her a small smile. She set her cup on the counter, her hands trembling slightly. "I cannot undo the years of what I said," she admitted. "But I can try to be better now." We stood side by side for a long moment. No apologies spoken, just a quiet understanding taking root. In the weeks that followed, I saw subtle changes. Olivia no longer dominated meetings with her voice. She took notes, carefully asked questions, even deferred when younger employees had something to add. Her edges softened not into weakness, but into something steadier. One afternoon, I stopped outside the hallway as she presented a revised sponsorship plan to James Miller. He nodded, slowly impressed, and she smiled, not with triumph, but with relief. Later that week, HR announced the initiative had been approved. The company newsletter featured Olivia's proposal as a cornerstone of our new community outreach. I read it on my screen, my lips pressing together in something between pride and disbelief. On Friday evening, as I was packing my bag, I noticed her standing by the recognition wall in the lobby. The names of top contributors for the quarter glowed on the screen, and hers was at the top. She stood with her hands in her pockets, shoulders back, no show of pride this time. She caught me watching and gave a small nod. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I returned the nod, words unnecessary. That Sunday, the family gathered at our usual brunch spot near Lincoln Park. The striped curtains, the smell of coffee, the clatter of plates. Everything looked the same, but something in the air felt changed. My mother was telling Uncle Henry about her flower beds when Olivia walked in 5 minutes late, as always, but different. Her hair tied back, simply, no sequin dress, just a white blouse and dark jeans. She slid into the seat across from me, her eyes meeting mine for a brief second before she gave a quiet nod. Uncle Henry leaned back in his chair with a chuckle. "So, Emily, are you still doing that little computer thing from home?" I opened my mouth, but Olivia's voice cut through before I could answer. "Uncle," she said firmly, "Emily is the smartest person I know. Without her, I would not even be where I am today." The table went silent. My mother blinked. My father shifted in his seat. Aunt Linda tilted her head with a small smile. I stayed quiet, watching Olivia hold their gaze with steady eyes. "I used to think I knew everything," she continued. "But Emily taught me something more important than knowledge. She taught me humility." Her words hung in the air like a lantern. My mother reached across the table, her hand squeezing mine. For the first time, the light was on me, not as an accident or a surprise, but as something earned. The conversation soon drifted back to weather and gardens, but I knew something important had shifted forever. After the meal, as we stepped out into the cold afternoon, Olivia walked beside me. She adjusted her jacket, her voice low so no one else could hear. "You do not have to forgive me. but I will never be the same person again. I looked at her, and for the first time in many years, I smiled without reservation. I know, I said softly, and I never needed an apology. We walked in silence toward our cars, not as rivals, but as sisters finally beginning to see each other clearly. The air was cold, but the space between us felt lighter. The next week at the office, I found myself standing in front of a group of interns who had been invited to hear about Datavision's journey. Usually Daniel would take these sessions, but this time he insisted I step forward. The room was filled with eager young faces, not unlike mine, had been years ago when I first sat in front of a glowing screen with no idea what I was building toward. I spoke honestly about the night spent debugging until sunrise, about the fear of failure, about how being unseen had once felt like a curse, but had given me the freedom to focus. I told them that sometimes being underestimated is the best fuel you can be given because it allows you to grow without distraction. Their eyes followed me not with awe, but with genuine curiosity, and I felt something settle inside me. The story I once kept hidden was now serving as a guide for others. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the sponsorship workshop Olivia had organized. The room was buzzing with energy. Young women in business casual leaned forward in their chairs, listening to department heads talk about career paths. Olivia stood near the back, quietly observing a notebook tucked under her arm. When she caught my eye, she smiled small and real. She had shifted from craving the spotlight to giving it away, and in that moment I saw a version of her I had never thought possible. As spring unfolded, our family gatherings felt less like performances and more like conversations. At Easter brunch, my father still fussed over the roast. My mother still directed traffic at the table, but when Uncle Henry started to tease me about spending too much time with computers, Olivia gently corrected him. Emily's work is why this family has a future to brag about. The table fell silent, then carried on, but I noticed my mother's hand linger on mine a little longer than before. One quiet evening in May, I sat on my balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. The river shimmered with the last light of day, and for the first time I did not feel the need to keep the curtains drawn. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel, a photo of a newspaper headline, announcing our new partnership with a hospital system. Below it he had typed, "Look how far we've come." I smiled and set the phone down, letting the city lights wash over me. A week later, Olivia stopped by my apartment unannounced. She carried a small box in her hands. Inside was a framed photo of the two of us as children, me holding a cheap plastic trophy from a school science fair, her beaming in a sequined costume from her dance recital. For years, she had been the star of that picture, the one everyone remembered. Now she held it out to me. "This belongs with you." I took it gently, feeling a tightness in my throat. We sat on the couch sipping tea, and for the first time in our adult lives, we spoke without competition. She told me about her fears, about how failure at her last job had shaken her more than she ever admitted, about how mocking me had been easier than facing her own doubts. I listened, not needing to remind her of the pain her words had once caused. The fact that she was saying them now was enough. By summer, Datavision hosted its first community event under the new sponsorship program. Olivia stood on stage, introducing young interns to leaders in the industry. I watched from the side, proud not just of the company but of her. She no longer needed the applause to feel alive. She had found meaning in giving others a chance. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Daniel joined me near the stage. "Looks like your sister finally figured out what matters," he said with a grin. I nodded, watching her laugh with a group of interns. She had figured it out, and so had I. The years of silence, of being overlooked, of carrying a truth no one knew had all led to this. Not revenge, not triumph, but understanding. The quiet kind that does not need to be shouted from rooftops, the kind that reshapes the way a family breathes together. One Sunday at our usual brunch spot, my mother leaned across the table and whispered, "I am proud of you, Emily." Her words were soft, almost hesitant, but they sank deep. My father raised his coffee in a small toast without saying anything. It was not perfection, but it was enough. As I walked out with Olivia beside me, she slipped her arm through mine. "We are not picture perfect," she said lightly, "but maybe we don't have to be." I laughed, a sound that felt unburdened, and we stepped into the afternoon sunlight together. This story, my story, taught me that sometimes the loudest victories are found in the quietest moments. Revenge is not always about destruction. Sometimes it is about building something so strong that truth eventually speaks for itself. And when that truth is finally seen, healing can begin. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated or pushed aside only to find strength in the silence? I would love to hear your stories. Share them in the comments, and if you want to keep walking through more family journeys with me, remember to like this video and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.